Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Eva Bartlett, a US-Canadian journalist in Russia who has been reporting for many years from wars and non-Western conflict zones, including Gaza, North Korea, and the Donbas. Eva, thanks for coming online.
Thank you very much for having me on, Pascal. I enjoy your show.
Thank you very much, and I really admire all the journalistic work you do because you don't, people like me, we comment on stuff, and then you are a real journalist. You go to these places and you look at things, and then you report what happens. How how come that you, as a North American, ended up going to all of these places, including North Korea, and then you started reporting from there and from Gaza, and what was your journey like?
I always like to be perfectly honest that I was apolitical. My family was apolitical. I didn't have any aspirations in journalism or politics when I was in high school or university. I was actually a musician and completely oblivious to anything to do with news or analysis or politics. But I did a lot of travel on my own. And after university, I ended up in South Korea teaching. And after 8 months of travel in Southeast Asia, my mind started to ask questions like, well, why am I seeing all this poverty in Cambodia? What happened in Vietnam? That was the degree of my ignorance, by the way, because I'm a product of a Canadian education system. I was born in the States, grew up in Canada, and we're just not taught unless you strike gold and you have good teachers. You're not taught the real history of the world. You're taught the history that they want you to know, which is very reductionist and factually incorrect. So I, I started just looking at news, and this is back in the early 2000s. And of course, Palestine at that time was very much in the news, not the mainstream news, but independent media. And so I started every day listening to news and becoming horrified about what I was hearing about then, which was what was happening in Palestine. And I thought, like many things, I thought, how can this be happening? I was that ignorant. How can there be occupation? How can I didn't even know about the Nakba back then? So it was like a slam in the face, like of reality, and I was horrified by what I was learning. And then I started later asking, well, why didn't I know this? But anyway, I decided that I would go for myself. So that was back again, 2004 or something. In 2007, I finally did get to occupied Palestine. I went to the West Bank via Jordan. I stayed 8 months there. At that time, I was an activist. So, and I don't regret it. It's not the title that I bear now because what I do is journalistic now. But back then, I was an activist. And with other internationals, the idea was that we would go to the places which were most worst affected by either the brutality of the Israeli army, the Israeli state, or the illegal colonists. And so as a consequence, I saw the aftermath of Israeli army invasions into cities and towns. I saw the humiliating and degrading, dehumanizing treatment of Palestinians at checkpoints. And I saw how these fanatic, absolutely absurd, absolutely hateful, vile, illegal colonists brutalize Palestinians and steal their land. I literally saw them stealing land over the course of many months in a hamlet called Susia, south of Hebron or Khalil in Arabic. And so I saw much more. And I also, by the way, it's worth noting, I saw how Palestinians protested nonviolently because the other side will say, well, why do you use violence? Why do resistance exist? Well, we can get into that, but Palestinians have also protested nonviolently for decades. And I saw it in the village of Belain and other villages where they're protesting the theft of their land, which was 60% of their land of that village was stolen in order to build the apartheid wall, separating Palestinians from the land, which Israel calls its security wall. And so I saw how the Israeli military would fire high velocity tear gas canisters into a crowd of unarmed protesters before anything happened, before any young protester threw a rock in retaliation. The Israeli army would unleash this volley of high velocity tear gas canisters, not always shooting them in the air, but shooting them into the crowd. 1 year after I was there, a young man who was a very gentle, peaceful, well-loved young man, Bassem Abu Rahme, was killed by one of these canisters that was fired from a very close proximity, several meters into his chest. The Israeli army also fired plastic coated lead bullets or rubber-coated lead bullets, which are often the rubber is slit to ensure that when the bullet impacts the body or the eye, because they often fire at the face, that the lead will come out of the rubber sheathing and do more damage. So they use that, and they use live ammunition as well. So I was seeing all these things 8 months in the West Bank. I was arrested one time for 2 days. That's not in itself a big story. However, it was because I was with Palestinians who were protesting the placement of the Israeli army's roadblock on their land, on a road that cut them off from the nearest city, Nablus. And when they removed that roadblock, then the army came and reinforced a roadblock with bulldozers and earth. And so, because we were there with Palestinians, we were arrested. And this is very interesting. The Israeli army said this is now a closed military zone. This is what they do in order to criminalize anyone who's in the area. So these Palestinians who were literally just on their land trying to clear the road so they could get to the nearest city, some of them were arrested and some of us activists were arrested. But that's even, not the big story. It's just the fact that they can do this, and they do arrest Palestinians all the time, every day in the West Bank for no reason whatsoever. And so that was a little glimpse into what Palestinians endure, a very little glimpse, because of course we know by now that Israeli torture of Palestinians in prisons is very widespread, to the extent that the Israeli public were protesting for the right for Israeli soldiers to rape Palestinians in jails. That's a long segue. I'm sorry. So basically, after that time in the West Bank, and I was ultimately deported by the Israeli authorities, I had already been in contact with someone, a journalist from Rafah in Gaza, and I was aware of how much infinitely worse the situation was in Gaza because it's so isolated and it was cut off. And I've been trying to get there. So in 2008, I finally arrived there on one of the flotilla movements, the first flotilla movement, the Free Gaza movement. So I arrived in November.
The one?
No, it was actually, it was 2 years before. I believe that was 2010. This was 2008. So the first boat arrived in, I think it was July or August, I think. It was actually 2 boats. Then the second one a month or 2 later. And then I was on the third. There are 5 missions, so 6 boats, but 5 missions actually arrived. And I was on the third in November. And after that, after the 5th mission, any boats thereafter that tried to enter the international waters and Palestinian waters were violently stopped by the Israeli Navy. I don't know why our boats got in, frankly. An Israeli gunboat did order us to turn around, but we had already collectively decided there was 25 or so people on board, most of whom were European members of parliament. There was also the Israeli journalist Amira Haas, who writes for Haaretz, and a few activists like myself. So for some reason, we were not attacked, which I'm very grateful for, because it enabled me to get to Gaza, where I then spent the next year and a half. I eventually left by Rafah, and then a year later, I came back and spent another year and a half there. And so, as a consequence of being in Gaza during that time, I was witness to 2 Israeli wars on Gaza. And it's now what we're seeing with the genocide, nearly 2-year-long Israeli genocide of Gaza, has been horrific, even beyond my imagination, even in spite of what I saw in Gaza. And so it seems perhaps inconsequential to talk about the 2008-9 war on Gaza, which Israel dubbed Cast Lead, or the November 2012 war on Gaza. But why I do feel it's relevant is to say this isn't because of October 2023. Israel was doing this to Palestinians, targeting and assassinating babies and children way back before this current genocide. And the other important aspect is the siege, which was implemented, I think, in 2007 by Israel and Egypt. It and all of the policies that Israel, we can get into, has been enforcing on Palestinians through brutality, terrorizing Palestinians, is very important in the lead up to what we're seeing now, in terms of just destroying their abilities to survive. And a lot of people don't realize that. But I'm sorry, I'll just finish my question. Your question was, how did I end up? So that's how I ended up in Gaza, in Palestine. And then in 2011, as you know, the war on Syria started. And I was in touch with people from the region, and I was following media that was not MSM. And so I didn't believe it was a revolution from the beginning. I didn't know anything about Syria. I didn't have any stereotypes for or against Syria, frankly. I was also ignorant about Syria, but but I understood that this wasn't a revolution. And I wasn't able to get there. I left Gaza in March 2013. The next year, I went to Syria in April 2014. And I went there a total of 15 times, sometimes for months on end, going every year, several times a year until 2021. So I had a very, I would say, detailed overview of how that war in Syria played out. And, during that time, then I was focused on Palestine and Syria. Events in Ukraine started. The Ukraine's war on the Donbas started. I was aware of it, but didn't get to the Donbas until September 2019. And then, as you mentioned, some other places, North Korea, DPRK, and Venezuela as well. So it started as me being absolutely appalled at what was happening in occupied Palestine by the Israeli state, army, and illegal colonists against Palestinian civilians, to seeing the greater context of the connectedness of the U.S. hegemony over the region and Israel doing the U.S.'s bidding in Palestine and now in Syria and Lebanon and beyond.
This, we need much more time. We only have 1 hour, and the depth of your experiences is so profound that we would need much more time to go into your different experiences. And I'm absolutely sure, and I'm sorry that we won't be able to render justice to all of this, but the you have this bird's eye view of what happens in these in all of these conflict zones, and a large part of it, especially in Gaza and with the Palestinians, but also with Syria and also with the Donbas, um, is fueled on on the belief of people who just go with these mainstream narratives. And the thing about the mainstream narratives is that they do get parts of the story and convey them, but then they leave other parts completely, utterly out. We see that right now. I mean, anyone with more than just a Canarian like brain remembers that there was a history of the Palestine Israel conflict before the 7th of October, and some people might even remember that there was the Great March of Return, and that there were 200 Palestinians who were shot on Gazans shot on their side of the fence while protesting peacefully on their side of the goddamn fence,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
and this is just one of the most recent examples, and this whole thing goes back over decades, right? But the thing that frustrates me that much, and that you did something concretely about, is that you won't know unless you actually go, or unless you try to engage with people from there, or with media that tries to portray the other side of the story. This issue
Yeah.
of narrative building that you actively try to contribute, against the one-sided narrative building. How, in your mind, is it possible in free societies? And I do think the Western societies are generally free. How is it possible that you have so many stupid narratives being built up that then support this Western hegemony?
Because it's so prevalent not only in legacy media, but it's everywhere, right? It's in late night talk shows, it's in comedy clubs, it's even on a visit back to Canada. My first visit back to Canada after being away from Canada for 4 years, I went back finally last year to see my elderly mom. And even in public space, I overheard a young guy talking about ugly Russians. And I just said to him, "How do you know? Have you been to Russia?" And he's like, I said, maybe you should try going there and talking to Russians and seeing if they're as dumb and ugly and stupid and pejorative that you want to insert as you think they are. And he was like, uh, and he actually came up to me a couple of days later. He said, I want to apologize for what I said. He said, I don't know. It just came out. And I said, well, thank you for your apology. I really appreciate that. That was just a very small example, but like he was just spitting out something he heard somewhere on one of these different platforms, TikTok, whatever. I don't know. And so when it's so prevalent, and in Hollywood, of course, as well, people are just immersed in it, right? They don't even know it's a stereotype, it's a lie, it's whatever. So it's immensely frustrating because then myself or colleagues will be somewhere, whether it's Syria or Donbass, and we'll be saying like, hey, for example, Donbass, actually, today is, the 30th. So 3 years ago today in Donetsk, in the evening of July 30th, Ukraine fired I don't know how many rockets it was, containing these little mines dubbed petal mines. And they're really nefarious little things because you can barely see them. They blend in really well with the ground. They're neutral colors, green or brown. And like even when I saw them on the ground, I couldn't see them at first. I really had to struggle to see them because they just really blend in that well. And so Ukraine fired these little bloody mines, and they're so delicate that it only takes like 3 or 5 kilograms to set one off. So anything stepping on it, handling it, an animal, a child, a foot, will make these mines explode. And they have a very powerful force. So they blow off feet or even lower limbs. And so I was in Donetsk when these mines, oh, actually, they had been fired before that night, but this is when they like completely covered the streets, parks, streets, sidewalks, courtyards of apartment buildings, playgrounds. Throughout not just Donetsk, but neighboring districts and other cities, Gorlivka, Makivka. And until today, now, the number of people maimed by the mines, I think it's 184 was the last count I saw. I met one young boy, a 14-year-old, whose lower leg was blown off, a really sweet guy. And he was, I mean, it just sounds like a story, but he was walking through a playground to go see his grandmother, and he stepped on one of these mines and blew his lower leg off. And so anyway, my point being,
And these
on
are not
X,
weapons that help you to win a war. These are
no,
weapons that
no,
just terrorize a population, right? That
thank you
are
for adding that.
purely there in order to make sure that the people on the other side have as bad a time as humanly possible.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. They're internationally banned, and Ukraine, I believe until recently, but at least Ukraine was a signature to the prohibition of these mines, and we had a stock of 6 million that it was supposed to destroy. But when I wrote about it a couple of years ago, it had only destroyed just over 2 million. And so anyway, what I was going to say is that, but I really appreciate you making that point because they have no strategic objective in civilian areas, which is where Ukraine fired them. They're not going to win the war, as you say. They're just going to terrorize the population and maim them. And the other point about them is that they lie dormant, like many mines. They lie dormant for years. So even if sappers have gone through an area and deemed it clear of mines, what can happen is there can be one stuck in a tree or on a rooftop that can blow or be swept away with rain, and then an area that was deemed safe is no longer safe. And that happened actually. A sapper from I don't remember if he was from Donetsk or a Russian sapper there, had his foot blown off when a sapper in an area that was deemed safe, stepped on a mine.
Yeah, and I mean, the laws of war and the international humanitarian law are pretty clear about the illegality of targeting civilians, and that goes for both sides. I mean, international humanitarian law doesn't differentiate between who started it, who's defending. It's like you are not allowed to attack civilians, and usually what happens is that both sides do this kind of stuff. But what our media then does, it spins these narratives in which only one side is pure evil, and currently, of course, the narrative is the Russians are attacking civilians and are terrorizing them, whereas the Ukrainians are bravely just defending themselves and are only attacking, military installations. And the, independent reporting, of course, does something to clear that these kinds of things up on both sides. And you did that also for the case of Israel, and all of the I mean, the illegality of the way that Israel is fighting its extermination campaign, I mean, blows the roof off even like the Ukraine-Russia war, like many, many times. So it's actually on a different scale. But why is it that you think that Western reporters who should also be interested in that, so few of them go? I mean, we have others in the West. We have Chris Hedges who did that, and even exited. He was working for the New York Times, right? Originally, Chris Hedges.
Maybe I can't
Uh,
remember. I think
and
so.
and went out, and we have a couple of people who do that, but they are far and few between. Why aren't there more?
Who go to any place in specific, or just generally
Just
go to the?
generally, and then work on this. I mean, also with you in the Donbas and so on. How many people, like Western journalists, who actually seriously try to understand what was going on? How many do you have? I mean, there must be.
I mean, there's a number of independent Western journalists that have gone there or are based there. I can think of many, but if you mean like legacy media, I can't think of many. Actually, in early 2022, so I've been to the Donbass 10 times. The first time, as I said, in September 2019. The rest of the times, mostly throughout 2022, and then a couple of times in subsequent years. But most of those times I went, in fact, almost like all of those times except one, I went on my own. The one time was with a delegation from the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense. This is in March. I forget the exact date. It was a whirlwind 2-day, I think it was, delegation. We were in both Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics. The point I want to make is actually 2 weeks prior in Donetsk on a very central street, Ukraine had fired a Tuchka-U cluster munitions missile. And I think 21 people were killed. I'd have to double check that number. But anyway, significant number of people were killed. And so of the places we went to this street, which is a very central street in Donetsk, where one of the munitions landed and where people were killed. And there was a small photo display. Actually, there's an important point I'll make with this. A small photo display from the day of people standing around, people who were injured or people, the chaos, the damage, people grieving. And there were 2 French media on this delegation. And there was also representatives of Arab media, some of which are media that I wouldn't respect because they took part in the war propaganda against Syria. But the French media, I was curious to see their mainstream television media. I was curious to see how they would report. And so basically, after the 2 days, we went to a city called Volnovakha, and I can talk a bit more about that. We went around Lugansk. We saw areas. Okay, Volnovakha was one area where the fighting had ended and the Russian army was giving out humanitarian aid. Another area in the Lugansk People's Republic, Shastia, same thing. And what you saw was a very orderly setup of people lining up, really desperate for the aid, and being given pretty healthy looking parcels of food and sanitary hygienic aid. And in Volnovakha, we talked with the chief physician of the hospital that was almost completely destroyed. And what's notable is he said specifically, Ukrainian forces occupied the hospital. They mined the ICU before they left. He said this very specifically. Then some journalists asked him a question like, which forces was it? I think they were trying to know if it was Azov or who it was. The doctor said, I don't know. French media took the doctor saying, I don't know, cherry-picked that, distorted the whole thing and said, left out the part about him saying specifically the Ukrainian forces were occupying the hospital and refused to leave and they mined the ICU. Didn't include any of that. Just said, I don't know, as if like he doesn't know what caused the damage to the hospital. The implication being, of course, it was Russia. And then they didn't say anything about anything else we saw. They didn't talk at all about the 8 years prior to 2022 of Ukraine's war on the Donbas, which we heard about at length from Denis Pushilin in Donetsk. And the head, I'm sorry, I forget his name, of the Lugansk People's Republic also. And we saw a horrific display of photos in Lugansk showing what the 8 prior years of Ukrainian attacks and also the Nazi elements and the torture of civilians. This photo display was laid out. Media didn't talk about that. They didn't talk about anything except this is what the Russian government wants us to see, the food being handed out. So they're basically saying, this is a mockery. Like this is just this is all fake kind of thing. And specifically cherry picking the words of that doctor. By the way, I went back to Volnovakha many times. And on one of the occasions I went back to that hospital and I didn't see that doctor again, but I talked with other staff and they told me before Russian forces even entered Volnovakha, Ukrainian forces were shelling the hospital. And of course, this is not surprising if we're aware of what they did in Mariupol and elsewhere. So that was an example of media actually being there and cherry picking and not telling the truth. And they did that in Syria as well. Channel 4 News did that in Syria. Christian Groom Murphy, he did that too. He grossly whitewashed the terrorism of the different terrorist factions in eastern Aleppo. He totally minimized the damage they did to Syrian civilians, which was 10 or I think it was 11,000 civilians alone, not military, killed by the terrorist shelling by the time that Aleppo was liberated in late 2016. Shelling and sniping. And these media were there. BBC was there. They don't talk about that. BBC's Lise Doucet was there in Syria, in Damascus, old Damascus, when I happened to be there on my first visit in April 2014. And terrorist forces in eastern Ghouta were constantly shelling Damascus. Everybody knew where it was coming from because this is another disingenuous aspect. When you are under fire, you know where it's coming from, whether you're in Donbas, whether you're in Gaza. Well, Gaza, it's obvious, or in this case, in Damascus. So, but what Lise Doucet did was the shelling had killed one child and injured 60 because it hit an elementary school. And some of the kids were being treated in what's called the French hospital. So we went to the French hospital, and Lucy Say was there. And a nun, Mother Agnes Mariam, who's a pretty clever woman, when she realized this was BBC, she was like, I want to know, are you going to tell the truth? And Lisa Say was just kind of nodding her head, yes, yes. And Mother Agnes was saying, are you going to tell the truth that terrorist forces shelled this school and these children are injured by it? Lisa Say nodded her head. She later wrote a report for the BBC in which she said, verbatim, I don't remember, but it was like the regime quote claims it was rebels quote, but locals believe it was the regime, which is complete bullshit, if I can say so, because as I said, everybody knew where they're coming from. And so it was so dishonest, putting the blame of the shelling that terrorized Syrians in Damascus, in Aleppo, elsewhere, but in this case in Damascus, saying that it was the government doing it. It's exactly the way media spins. Back to my point about the petal mines, which I didn't finish my point, I'm sorry, but recently Grok, the expert of X, determined that my reports were false. Seeing the petal mines, talking with experts. I'm not a ballistics expert, but I talked with them. And they're the ones that told me and other journalists these were fired in rockets containing over 300 of these mines in cluster munitions, which disperse they explode in the air, they disperse, they flutter. Anyway, I was told all this by somebody who actually is a ballistic expert. And Grok decides, because of Reuters, Human Rights Watch, Channel 4 Snopes. Channel 4 Snopes had nothing to do with the Donbas. They've smeared me about my reporting from Syria, and I've done a rebuttal saying why their smears were incorrect. But anyway, Grok snatches all these legacy media and other sources that do the reporting, quote unquote, of Washington, and therefore determine that what I saw with my own eyes is incorrect. So back to what you asked earlier, like, why don't people know, or how do people believe the lies? I mean, look how many times you see people at Grok. Hey, Grok, is this true? Is this accurate? And then Grok just puts out a bunch of crap that aligns with the Western narrative.
Yeah, and maybe this is a wonderful example. Like, Grok is not necessarily programmed to lie, but Grok draws on the same sources that you and I do. It just does so much quicker and in much larger quantity. And the fact that this media environment that we've created is able then to push like 100 times the story of let's take another one that was so ridiculous, that is so dumb, that it even seeps through into mainstream. The issue of who shelled the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, right? This nuclear power plant held by the Russians. Who is shelling that one? And Western media pretending that we can't know. I mean, both sides are saying something, right? We can't know who's shelling the one, because the Russians are so evil that sometimes they attack their own held like nuclear power plant, right? That's the level of evilness. And the fact that this is then written about like hundreds of times and pushed out, then leaves such a huge trail that we mistake familiarity with truth. And even Grok and these AIs can be led to believe that, oh, well, we've seen so much of reports saying this, and oh, so many saying something else, so this one must be discarded, right? The other one must be overwhelmingly more believable. So you have these massive attacks on media waves, right, that are being pushed forward. And even if you see it with your own eyes, you are then smeared. Your Wikipedia page is one huge list of allegations of all of your wrongdoings, Eva, right? Of how you...
I know. And actually, Grok drew from the Wikipedia page. I know, because unless they've edited it and corrected it, they had said minor thing, but they said I moved to Russia in 2019. I didn't. I moved here in 2021. Like, that's the extent of their research. So Grok actually cited that in one of the threads about me, that, like, Eva Bartlett's a Canadian-American conspiracy theorist, Russian blogger, blah, 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 Kremlin stooge, blah, 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 moved to Russia in 2019. I'm like, Grok, you can't even get that right. But actually, it was interesting. Somebody else, or maybe a couple of people, kept hammering away at Grok, like following up on Grok's assertion that I was reporting falsely about Ukraine's use of the petal mines. And by the end, Grok was actually saying, Eva, it was the video of the 14-year-old boy. And then somebody asked Grok, what does this depict? And he's like, this is Eva Bartlett's reporting on Ukraine's use of pedal mines on the Donbas, so it actually determined, like, it didn't go with the Western slant at that point for, because someone else had asked enough questions, I guess, I don't understand the mechanisms of how this works, but it changed its tune. There was a point I was going to make, though. What was that? Oh, Human Rights Watch. So Rock, actually, the interesting thing is Rock said, according to Human Rights Watch, it's Russia firing the mines. And actually, the Rock was referring to a report that came out in, I think, January 2023 by Human Rights Watch. And it decided that it suggested that Ukraine did use pedal mines in Izium, but didn't go as far as saying Ukraine used them in Donetsk, because obviously, I don't know, that's too much for human rights. It's like what you're saying earlier. Sometimes the media puts out a little bit of truth. But actually, in that report, Human Rights Watch actually said, I'm having a hard time saying that, actually said, we have no proof of Russia using pedal mines in Ukraine. So Grok didn't cite that, so it's very interesting.
I mean, the thing is, a lot of things float out there, and sometimes you see, like, explicitly the use of mis and disinformation by the West in order to sustain like key elements of the narrative that need to be true. One key element for Syria was that Assad is, like, trying to mass exterminate with gas and so on his own population, right? And we then later have these independent fact-finding missions that were set up through the OPCW that really came out with very inconvenient findings that, look, this makes no sense. These people, that's not what happened. And then the OPCW came itself under pressure and withdrew some reports. But we have fact finders who came out and said, like, look, this is a scandal. And this issue of fact-finding in conflicts is very important. And it's very old because it's difficult to know what precisely happened. But that's then what determines a political action. How far do you think are we today in having more chances at knowing, at making sense of these events? Because we do have social media now. We have this direct way of exchanging, but still determining truth. Because again, like, the truth with you is, okay, I ask you, you give me an answer, and I just trust that that's your fair and honest opinion, right? But we have no other way than this. What else is there that we can draw on in order to come to valid conclusions?
Just before I answer that, I want to just touch on Ghouta, one of the places, well, the main place that the Syrian army was accused of using a chemical weapon. I went there like 2 weeks after the accusations, and I went to the medical point, the scene where the white helmets staged, hosing down a little boy who went on later to go with 18 or something other Syrians to testify that actually there wasn't a chemical attack, and that this boy was paid like candy or something to, like, let them hose him down. I went to that medical point and I talked with a young man. He wasn't a doctor, he was a medical student, but he told me what happened. And I asked him, like, hey, were any of the medical staff that were treating so-called victims of a chemical weapon, were any of them wearing protective clothing? No. Were any of them sick afterwards? No. And he said also, like, what happened, because I speak Arabic. I don't speak, like, perfect classical Arabic, but I understand street Arabic very well, which is the common Arabic spoken every day. And so he said they came in shouting Kamawi. Kamawi is just a chemical in Arabic. And then so doctors, like, started doing something, but they weren't sure what to do, really. They were surprised. And then they quickly realized, no, we're just treating normal explosion related ailments, dust inhalation, it's other things. But the other point I wanted to make was then I walked around Ghouta and I talked with people, and I'm like, one-on-one with people. Yeah, I had a translator with me. That you had to have a translator with you. But frankly, usually the translator messed up and I could understand he was not saying the right thing. So anyway, I was asked people. And I also, by the way, I didn't like to ask, like, I didn't like to use loaded lexicon, like, what did the terrorist of Jaish al-Islam do to you? I just said, how was your life here under Jaish al-Islam, for example? And they were like, they starved us. They had control of all the food. They wouldn't let us work in our agricultural fields. They had all our cattle. They shot all the livestock before they left. These were things they were telling me. And I'm like, what about the chemical attack? And they're like, they didn't, if there was a chemical attack, they would have been tugging on my sleeve to tell me about it. what they were tugging on my sleeve to tell me about was the executions in the street committed by Jaish al-Islam and the hoarding of food and the starving civilians and the just pure terrorism. So
The
that's
moderate
just,
rebels.
yeah,
Those are the moderate rebels. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, there's so much I could say about that. But back to your question. So, well, I think in regards to social media and Gaza specifically, what's different now? Well, okay, what's different now between when I was there is that now it's a genocide, 100% a genocide for nearly 2 years, but it's being live streamed. And when I was there, we didn't have live streaming technology or capability. I would like literally go and film something, then go back. And if there was internet, I would write a report, or send a video, but usually it was just photos and reports. And now people are 24/7 live streaming their own genocide. And so, I mean, it's just, whereas for the first like year plus, most media would not acknowledge it was a genocide. And at best, people would say, like, well, there might be elements for intent to genocide. And now people are outright saying it's a genocide, finally, because it's undeniable. And so I guess in terms of knowing the truth, like, for example, if we look at the Gaza so-called humanitarian foundation, right? The U.S. Israeli supposed aid group that basically insisted only they could operate in Gaza to distribute humanitarian aid under the premise that Hamas was stealing aid. And actually, the Cradle was the first outlet I saw that was talking about, I'd have to look for his name. Oh, Abu Shabab. Anyway, a Palestinian, but working for the Israelis and linked to ISIS. And his terror gang were responsible for looting the aid and also doing so under the protection of the Israeli army. And even now, like the other day, I saw someone posted that U.S. aid, who obviously, like, they're not going to be pro-Palestinian or pro-Hamas. U.S. aid found no evidence of Hamas stealing aid. So under that premise of this being the only way, not the UN, not UNRWA, and I'm not a fan of the UN, I'm just saying the UN Relief Works Agency had mechanisms in place to deliver aid throughout Gaza. It wasn't enough. It wasn't sufficient. It wasn't great aid, but it was aid, and it was the mechanisms were in place. Now we see a very Hunger Games dystopian scenario playing out where Palestinians are herded like livestock into pens, long pens, to try to get to the point where any aid might be distributed. And they're just sitting there like sitting ducks as Israeli and US mercenaries fire upon them. And of course, the Israeli side will say, well, this is crowd control, firing like live ammunition. And even according to one, I guess he was a US beret or something like that, US Army, forget his name. He recently spoke out saying, like, this is a war crime. I saw them firing tank rounds into the population, unarmed civilians, unarmed starving civilians is what he actually specified. And yet, then the Israeli media and Israeli leadership will say, nobody's starving in Gaza. It's Hamas. If anyone's hungry, it's Hamas. Like, Hamas is taking the aid, and it's just, it's so, you have the footage of people being gunned down.
It is insane on so many levels. I mean, again, Hunger Games, like post-apocalyptic scenes that we see that are being recorded, right? And the gunning and shelling down of these people being recorded, and luckily it gets out. But also this week, I mean, the counter narrative now that Israel is building up is like the UN is the one holding up 600 trucks loaded with food. The UN is not distributing. The crime of hunger is on the hands of the UN, and they just push that out. And it's being pushed out massively. Like, it's the number of tweets I see about this by these obviously Israeli, like, I don't know whether they're real people or just bots. I don't know, but it all goes into this one direction. It's insane. But asking us to believe that while Gaza is hermetically sealed off by the Israeli army, but that it is the UN that is blocking aid. While the Israelis say, like, the only one who's allowed to operate here is this humanitarian foundation, right? They do that at the same time. Yeah. And still it works. In some quarters of the West, it works. And some people go like, oh, yeah, but Hamas should release the hostages. If they release the hostages and dissolve, then all of this would be gone. And it would be paradise. And Israel would, of course, then establish all people would be good.
Well, so that's why then I go back to the point I was making earlier, like, about my experiences a decade, what is it now? A decade and a half ago in Gaza. Because not only was it, documenting the two wars, but in 2009, I was with Palestinian medics riding in their ambulances. So I was seeing firsthand who they were rescuing. And I was also able to say, like, look, in none of the ambulances I was in were they transporting resistance fighters, what Israel would call, quote unquote, terrorists, because that was one of their excuses for attacking and killing, murdering Palestinian medics, is saying the ambulances were transporting Hamas. And I'm able to say in full honesty, that is not true. I never saw them transporting resistance in my experience. On the other hand, an ambulance I was in came under Israeli sniper fire during ceasefire hours. I can testify to that. In fact, the guy I was with filmed it. So there was like 14 or so shots from an Israeli sniper during ceasefire hours at this ambulance, at the medics who were uniformed, unarmed, and picking up a body off the street. But what I was going to say also, not only that, but like that, what I alluded to earlier is that all these policies Israel has implemented, not only the siege, but the siege should not be downplayed either, because it's so brutal. They literally prevented diapers and food and fertilizers and seeds and anything you can think of, cooking gas. Palestinians started using kerosene to cook over. They Israelis prevented kerosene from entering. Just like the basics of life, Israel prevented from entering, including especially medicines and medical equipment. And so the crisis, the crisis of, well, the hospitals have a crisis in Gaza because they've been bombed and destroyed and invaded and bombed again by Israel. But even prior to 2023, back in 2008, when I got there, the hospitals were in a constant state of crisis and a desperate need for critical medicines. And that's been going on since then, So there's the Israeli people post periodically on X. They'll be like, Israel is shooting at fishers. Yeah, they've been doing that forever. They'll shoot at fishers, whether they're on a haska, which is like a paddle board. They paddle out, drop the nets, and pull the nets in later. And so they're on this haska. They're usually just wearing shorts. So they got this thin Palestinian fisher in shorts, very clearly unarmed. And the Israeli Navy will shoot at him. Or if they're in a fishing trawler, this massive Israeli gunboat comes at the trawler and either shells it, machine guns it, or uses a heavy-powered, heavy-duty water cannon to shatter the window, break the equipment, and they put a chemical in that water cannon that leaves the Palestinians smelling like excrement for days. And they abduct the fishers, and they take the fishing boats. So like all these things, Israel has been destroying their economy with the siege and with the attacks on farming. Same thing. And I used to volunteer with farmers, so we came under Israeli gunfire all the time. You can hear the bullets whizzing past your head. It's not warning shots in the air. If we weren't there, they would have shot the Palestinians in the heads or in the bodies. And they did. They killed many Palestinians. They injured many Palestinians who were just farming. And whether they were like young men working as paid laborers, or women too, they work as paid farmers, or entire families, the Israeli army shot at them.
How?
Under the pretext of security, when it was there at the border, they have their high surveillance technology. They can see they're shooting at unarmed civilians. They were doing it to push them off the land. And how are they supposed to live, whether they're growing their own food or working to earn some money for the family? And so every aspect of their life was under Israeli control and was under destruction by Israel. And this is from 2000, and I went there in 2008, but I don't know when the attacks on farmers and fishers started, probably long before that, but at least since the time I was there and beyond. Like, this has been what Palestinians being locked in here into Gaza in this very small area, can't leave, can't go for medical care. The Israelis won't let them, can't go for study abroad, so they won't let them. And on top of which, every conceivable way to live is taken from them. Like, it's just, so to talk about October 7th or release the hostages, release the 10,000 Palestinian hostages.
How are they surviving? I mean, this onslaught that we are also seeing is so horrific, but still people cling on. People cling to life, and even the resistance is still out there. I mean, Hamas didn't dissolve. How is that one possible under these kind of conditions?
I can't speak to Hamas. Like, I'm not privy to, how their tunnels or how they're surviving. What I can say is they're still inflicting a major let's see, they're targeting the Israeli army, killing Israeli soldiers, maiming them, destroying the equipment. So they're still putting up a very good fight. And apparently it's caused a lot of concern in Israeli society. But for Palestinian, the civilians, they have such an amazing resilience. Like Gaza, it actually was a beautiful place. That I don't mean just Gaza City, I mean all of Gaza. There were beautiful scenes in Gaza, in spite of the destruction and the manufactured poverty. But I think for me, the most beautiful was the people because they just had this amazing resilience to find joy in the smallest things. I mean, you still see it now on X. You'll see like a photo or a video of a child finding joy, like surrounded by death. I mean, not dead bodies, but like, that child is in that environment where every day is death for he or she. And then somehow they'll find joy in the smallest thing, or people will create joy for them, like you do see it. So like their will to exist and survive is just, I think that few people in the West would have that drive. I think that few people in the West could survive the hell and horrors that Palestinians have endured for so long. And you would expect it would make them hateful, Palestinians, but in my experience when I was there, they were very loving people. Yeah, they hate the US government for what it does, supporting Israel, arming Israel. But they didn't hate, I can't speak for every person, but in my experience, those I met welcomed people. They welcomed foreigners, welcomed them into their homes, wanted to feed them with whatever little they had. And I just think like but that's talking about the spirit and the will to survive. How they're actually existing is, I don't know, because they can't, it's very difficult for them to get clean drinking water if they even can. And food is non-existent. Like they're literally starving. I mean, it might have been a week ago. I forget which body, but basically the alert was put out that they're at such a stage of this manufactured famine, the starvation, this deliberate starvation of them. Many of them are at a point of no return, where even if they were fed, their body's too far gone, and it's horrific. And then if you recall last year, the Lancet put out its report saying, considering indirect deaths, the number could be almost 200,000. I think they was like 186,000 or something like that. And then others like Dr. Mads Gilbert, a Norwegian doctor who's courageously volunteered in Gaza. He was there when I was there in 2009, volunteering in Shifa Hospital. Anyway, he's got a lot of experience in Gaza. And he was saying, and others, researchers were saying the number could be double that. If you include various, if you include obviously the bodies not accounted for under the rebels, the main one, but and then include the other things that will lead the indirect deaths, which I in an article I wrote last year argued they're actually still direct in my opinion, because they're as a result of Israeli policies creating the scarcity of clean drinking water, the lack of an operating medical system, all that. But due to disease and all the related food and water diseases, more people would die. And then recently I saw a report. Now this was, I forget the guy's name, I'm sorry. But he was saying, based on that Lancet report, he did his own calculation, and given the amount of time, I can find it for you, but basically in sum, he was saying now the number of deaths from direct and indirect, he was saying could be, what was the number, 484 or something like that, thousand.
The general estimate is that the one that I also that we see in several places, also in from humanitarian organizations, but that I also got from a Palestinian colleague in Bethlehem, is that the population went from 2.2 million now to about 1.8, and it's fair to say that maybe 100,000 managed to get out somehow, so that they're not dead, but gone. But the population has decreased at least by 400,000.
Actually, and there was that Israeli academic that wrote a report that was published in Harvard something publication. And in that report, what got people's attention was on it was 8 or 9 page report on page 5 or something. There was a graphic showing, he was also describing these so-called humanitarian fund points. And he was fairly honestly saying these are just death traps. But there was a graphic which showed I think the population zones estimated by, I believe it was by the Israeli army. And that's where people notice like there's like 400,000 or more missing. Like you said, the population should have been 2.2 million and the graphic accounted for like 1.8 million.
The what the horrors of the genocide are one thing, and unfortunately, it's not the first genocide that Western populations bring upon others. Of course, the Holocaust with the genocide against the Jews. We had the Germans, genociding Namibia. We've had the extermination of the North American continent by European settlers. We've got this genociding all over time and again. But the idea, of course, is that today this wouldn't happen anymore because we're too well informed and we don't want it to happen anymore. And we see it happen still. I mean, this is the largest crime that I can remember. This is larger than the crimes committed even in Syria. And it's this media environment and the environment of power that then somehow at the other end produces these horrors. Do you have any hope that in this multipolar world that we're going into, and where we have a Russia, where we have a China, where we have BRICS, that we will be able to, as a humanity, to create the mechanisms to prevent this? Because it seems to me quite ingrained, actually, in a Western European way of doing stuff. And by Western European, I actually mean the emigrated Europeans to the North Americans as well, to North America as well. Like this, there's something really dark about the way that our civilization actually does things.
So, but your question is, does it seem like in the future we can prevent such
Because like
atrocities and genocides?
you're living in Russia and you've been able to move around, and you are one of the journalists who actually also managed to give these counter narratives and show parts of the horror that are going on that don't make it into the mainstream narrative. Do you think that we will have more chances with a world that's not completely a media environment that's not completely under the control of of the top dog?
Um, in terms of media and controlling the media, I think I can't give the numbers, but it seems like there's been a massive shift in public awareness and mistrust of the media. So I would say that at least the dominance of the legacy media has definitely plummeted. But I mean, we can't even stop this ongoing genocide that everybody admits is a genocide, the deliberate starvation of Palestinians by Israel that everybody admits is being done by Israel. We can't stop that. I mean, we have the United Nations. It can wring its hands and say we're concerned, but it doesn't actually can't do anything to stop it. And I think I think many people like myself are pulling their hair out every day thinking, what can we do to make this stop? Um, and none of the so-called international bodies that in theory should stop this can or will. I firmly believe we need to support the resistance. Who are the ones actually giving Israel a slight pause? It's for example, Yemen. Their targeting of ships, making the statement saying, if these ships are in any way affiliated with Israeli ports, we're going to target them until the genocide of Palestine stops. The genocide of Gaza stops. That's concrete action. And if we see more of that, I mean, when Iran retaliated against Israel's unprovoked and illegal attacks on Iran, and Iran didn't even use, from what all accounts, did not even use its highest high-tech arsenal. It started out with very, I'm not going to get into it because I can't specify exactly what they used, but they started out with basic missiles, and they started to use advanced missiles. They didn't even use their most powerful things, and Israel was already crying. I mean, they did significant damage in Israel. If that were to occur again, if Iran was to retaliate again with more powerful munitions, I mean, we might see, I don't know, I can't predict like the end of the state of Israel. And by this, I want to be clear, I'm not calling for people to kill all Israelis. I'm saying the end of this racist apartheid state. For decades, some Palestinians have been calling for a one democratic state, which would ensure fairness, freedom to all citizens, and unlike this current demonic Israeli state. But anyway, that's an aside. Like, to my point is that I only see hope in supporting the resistance. I only see hope in various resistance, whether Hezbollah or Yemeni resistance, Palestinians resistance in Gaza, in causing Israel to stop. Or maybe Israel will run out of munitions. I don't know, but I don't see any international body coming in to stop the bloodshed, because it hasn't so far, and it won't. The way the UN is engineered, it was part of the creation of Israel, or ensured the creation of Israel on Palestinian land. So I'm not hopeful in the regard of, like, even BRICS, uh even if BRICS was like fully dominant power right now, I don't know that would be able to stop the Israeli genocide. So I'm fairly cynical in that regard.
No, no, you're right. The question to me is, how much does it take until the supporters of Israel, the Western supporters, actually start realizing, oh my, what's going on is actually horrendous, because you don't need to bomb Israel, not at all. You shouldn't. You should just not deliver weapons. You should just not trade, like, and shovel money and all of these ammunitions into the state. It wouldn't be able to do what it does. So and this is where, the whole media narrative to me is an integral part of the genocide, that this idea that Israel is defending is only like doing a war of self-defense, and if it wasn't for evil Hamas, then everybody in the region would live peacefully, while ignoring all the ways in which Israel not just is fighting, not just Palestine, it's fighting Lebanon, it's fighting Syria, it's fighting every single neighbor, and we're still pretending that this one is the self-defending part. It's
I'm sure you know,
mind-boggling.
Pascal, but Israel was well on very good terms with Al Qaeda and ISIS terrorists in Syria. Israel was treating Syria's terrorists, I'm sorry, in Israeli field hospitals and funneling them back into Syria. So, like, Israel has, and over the years, Israel has illegally bombed Syria. So, like you say, this idea that Israel is just defending itself now against Hamas, when Israel has been bombarding neighboring countries for a very long time.
It's so awesome because it is so nefarious, right? And then you help these people, including Al-Jolani and so on. And the
Mm.
second you don't need them anymore, you relabel them as terrorists, and then you go and you bomb the crap out of them, right? And you say like they're terrorists. And so you foster your own like controlled opposition that you can then bomb again. And the sick thing is that some of these factions actually, they think they're smarter than that, and they can use Israel, when in fact they're then like 2 3 years down the road they're on the chopping block, and that then sustains the mass violence, that Israel then is able to wage. It's Eva, I'm sorry. These interviews then become a little dark, but it's difficult to talk about the genocide and not get dark. Um, what is your recommendation to people who want to follow you, or who want to follow reporting that you trust? Where should they go?
Let's see. I find it very difficult on X. There's still a great deal of shadow banning and manipulation. So, I mean, there's a number of accounts I follow on X, but they don't always get seen by people. I get told myself that my account isn't, people say, well, I didn't even know you're still on X. So I rely more on Telegram channels these days. My own Telegram channel is, what is it? Reality Theories. And I share my own work, but I also share other people's work, people who I think have either written or otherwise spoken truth that I think should be heard. I use my blog. I'm not a blogger now. I used to be, but I use my blog to republish my writings or interviews, etc. My blog is ingaza.wordpress.com. But there's a number of independent media that do really good reporting. I can't possibly cite them all now. I'm happy to send some links, but I would say, rule of thumb, if you're hearing it in the mainstream media, generally assume it either to be not true or the opposite of reality. So that's just generally if people are looking for truth. Um, and so your question is, where can people go for honest reporting, right?
What do you recommend?
I recommend finding a diverse amount of sources. So like you actually said earlier, like Eva, you can tell me something and I can choose to believe you or not. And that's true. Like you can choose to believe me or not. But if I tell you, hey, this is what I saw in Donbas, in Syria, in Gaza, and then you see other people maybe with a video report of it, and you see, a number, like you see it start to align, then you realize, okay, this person is telling the truth, and then you start following them and see they have a track record. I'm not talking about me, I'm saying in general. So it is good not just to believe one source. It is good to diversify and get as many sources that have hopefully like a firsthand experience or visual videos or testimonies, etc. But to rely on just one source, especially if it's legacy media, is a bad strategy.
Yeah. Think for yourself. Look at sources, and
Yeah.
don't just believe what comes from the biggest broadcasters.
Or
Eva
Grok.
Bartlett, Eva, I know. I will put, if you send me some links, I will put them into the description below so that people can also like find you and find your sources as well. Um, Eva Bartlett, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me on, and people should follow you as well.